Good morning, bonjour, 晚上好. Welcome everyone to the launch of our survey report, How China Sees the World in 2023. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the interim director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta and one of the main contributors to this survey report. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Our program today will begin with a presentation and discussion of the key findings from our Chinese Citizens Global Perception Survey, to be followed by Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can find our full report now live by visiting our website listed in the chat. The rising tension between China and Western nations has centered on China using its growing economic and political might to assert its influence worldwide. Such tensions have led Western countries to consider China as an economic and military competitor, a systematic rival, and at the same time, a negotiating partner on select global issues. But a greater focus has been placed on competition and rivalry. Though China repeatedly appears in media headlines, there's very little understanding, backed by quantifiable research, of how the Chinese public perceive their country's international roles and its relationship with major foreign powers. In our modest attempt, our report aims to address this gap. In addition to offering insights into Chinese public perception of major global jurisdictions, we endeavor to highlight the complexities of public sentiments and their effects on China's international behavior. How Chinese citizens perceive the world has profound implications for China's future behavior, both domestically and abroad. Our survey examined mainland Chinese residents' perspectives on the country's current relations with global actors, including Australia, Canada, the EU, France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, the UK, and the US. This report discussed key findings in 5 main areas, namely Chinese citizens' general global perception, China's global roles, foreign tourism study work and immigration preferences, Canada-China relations, and finally, Chinese citizens' sources and knowledge of global jurisdictions. Now, with great pleasure, I would like to introduce my esteemed colleague and lead author, Dr. Reza Hasmas, whom I had the pleasure of working very closely with over the past few months on this project. Dr. Hasmas is a professor of political science at the University of Alberta and academic advisor of the China Institute. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge and has previously held faculty positions at the Universities of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford. Professor Hasmas is a very productive author and has worked for think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and NGOs around the world. Reza, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to say a few words to you about this survey that we've just launched. Bear with me while I launch the PowerPoint deck. Okay. Excellent. So, as Shah has actually mentioned, we have seen these sort of rising tensions between China and Western jurisdictions in the last few years, particularly in this decade. And in fact, a lot of the sort of conversations has been about decoupling from China. And in fact, what we did see is earlier this week, at the G7 summit, we saw this idea that, well, Western jurisdictions are not necessarily decoupling from China, but then they went on to suggest ways in which they might actually decouple China. So even if you do have the rhetoric of decoupling or not decoupling, at the end of the day, we see around many Western jurisdictions is a wariness towards China. So there's a movement towards de-risking from China. So ultimately, we can suggest that China is perceived as a negotiating partner on select global issues, as an economic and military competitor, and a systemic rival promoting alternative models of governance. Now, as just sort of hinted, how Chinese citizens perceive the world has profound implications for China's future domestically and abroad. So while the Communist Party of China enjoys a monopoly over the political system, it does actually require political popular support and legitimacies for its policies. I mean, this has been quite historical, where the party has retained that sort of legitimacy from the populace. And in many respects, we can see this being reiterated by the fact that the party monitors public opinion, they conduct public opinion analysis. So ultimately, it suggests that the general public support or dissatisfaction with China's foreign policy and activities can translate to future support or dissatisfaction with the party and the state itself. Put differently, it's worthwhile for us to understand what the Chinese public thinks. Now, there has been surveys and polls conducted looking at what the Chinese public thinks. So, what makes this sort of this CCGPS survey, the Chinese Citizens Global Perception Survey, somewhat unique, is that we're doing not only an online sort of survey, but we're doing a telephone survey as well. And what that means, what distinguishes it, is that we are able to get a much more representative sample of the Chinese population. We're able to get those hidden populations, the rural populations, through the methodologies we've utilized. So unlike polls or flash polls that we might see coming out of China, over the last first quarter of 2023, we ultimately queried citizens from a geographical standpoint, from an income standpoint, variations in terms of marital status, education levels, gender, age, to have a representative sample and a statistically representative sample of how the Chinese general public views other jurisdictions and their relationships with China. So we looked at 10 different jurisdictions, as Xiao mentioned. And you can see that there was the Australias, the Canada, the EU, France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, the UK, and the United States. So that's the sort of the methodological approach we undertook there. We used a sort of a survey sort of company that is semi-detached to a university. And so we were able to utilize their experiences as well as our own experiences doing many surveys in China to leverage this sort of data. We ran data checks as well, so academic data checks at an academic standard. So we're super confident in the sort of validity of the sort of findings that we have here. So beyond that, let me say a few words about general global perception, and let's talk about more of the major findings we have from the survey. The first thing to point out, and this should not be surprising to those on this call, is that the United States is seen by the Chinese public as the most influential global power, outweighing other jurisdictions by a substantial margin. Russia and the EU were perceived to be the second and third most powerful jurisdictions, respectively. We're going to see throughout this report and this survey that Russia scores quite favorably throughout most of the indicators we examine. Interestingly enough, despite having a vast population, a growing economy, and possession of nuclear weapons, India was perceived as the lowest score out of all nations. Also, when we look at the European Union as a conglomerate versus Germany and France, we start seeing some variations there. So it's kind of interesting to see how the public perceives the conglomerate of the EU versus, say, two very influential member states of the EU. Canada scores at 4.2. Now, remember, throughout this particular survey results, we're using a 7-point Likert scale. So 4 is seen as the average or the norm. Anything below that or above that is seen with some sort of relevance, statistically anyways. So the key headline here is that the majority of respondents saw the United States as the most influential global power. Now, what's really fascinating is when we look at trust in global partners. Now, trust is super important. You have to trust an entity in order to engage in a meaningful sort of engagement with that entity. Put differently, if you are going to engage with China, or if China is going to engage with a Western jurisdiction, they need to have minimum levels of trust. So looking at trust is a great indicator to forecast current and future potential partnerships and the health of a relationship. Now, lo and behold, we see that respondents generally have low levels of trust in the United States, whereby Russia is seen as the most trusted actor. Again, as I mentioned, Russia scores pretty high in this particular survey, and I'll say a few words later onwards about what that means and why Russia is such a trustworthy partner. France and Germany, as I mentioned, very influential members of the EU, are viewed as much more trustworthy than the EU as a bloc. Although China has territorial disputes with both Japan and India, its citizens' perceptions of both nations are notably different. So another thing we sort of try to examine is if you're familiar with the jurisdiction, or if you self-report familiarity with the jurisdiction, rather, does that engineer greater trust? We see there's a strong correlation there. So familiarity with a jurisdiction is positively correlated with trustworthiness. And that kind of makes sense. The more intimate knowledge the citizenry has of a particular nation or jurisdiction, the more likely they are to trust that entity versus the entity they don't know very little about. Now, this holds true except for the United States. So we do see that even though people report high levels of familiarity, the US is not trusted as much in this regard. Now, another question we looked at is the long-term importance to China. So what we see here is that Russia is viewed as the most important sort of entity in terms of China's long-term future. This is really, again, in line with the general positive view of Russia throughout the survey. There's a perception that Japan is relatively insignificant to China's long-term future. If you look at the EU and the US, they're seen with higher regard, that they have quite strategic importance to China's long-term future. Canada and Australia are scoring in a very similar manner, but relative to the US and the EU and Russia, it's quite low, relatively speaking. So it tells you in many respects what this slide illustrates is who the citizenry believes plays a major role for China's future. And here again, as I said, Russia, the EU, and the US are the top three in this respect. Moving on, we also asked citizens about the likelihood of military conflict in the next decade. What's particularly interesting is that this public perceives the United States as the jurisdiction that is most likely to engage in military conflict with China in the next decade. That should not be surprising given the sort of tensions and the sort of rhetoric on both sides towards each other. And the sort of and this permeates throughout the public's consciousness as well. Japan and India, the nations that have territorial disputes with China, rank second and third respectively. And we see Canada and Australia, we see France and Germany, the UK are seen as not likely to have a military conflict in the next decade. And again, Russia is seen as the sort of jurisdiction less likely or the least likely to have a military conflict in the next decade. So that's a sort of the general perceptions we see that the Chinese citizenry has towards these jurisdictions. Another thing we asked throughout the survey is what do citizens believe is China's global roles? So what sort of leadership capacity should China have in the next few years? So citizens were acutely asked to rate which areas China should take a, quote, active global leadership across 8 categories of global engagement. So we've asked them about international trade, global financial standards, environmental governance, technology and innovation, education, poverty alleviation, public health, and peace and security. What we did see is that peace and security is the most important issue area for the Chinese global leadership. We do see that there's a lot of party slogans and party rhetoric over the last few years regarding China's peaceful rise. And it seems that the citizenry echoes a lot of the sort of intentions, or at least the sort of stated intentions of China's global rise to be one that's peaceful and one that preserves the global sort of order from that standpoint. What's interesting, and perhaps interesting to those on this call, is what was the next sort of issue area. It was technology and innovation as a key priority. And here's noteworthy because we do see that technology and innovation is a major component of China's current 5-year plan. It's also been the source of major frictions between China and the West. We see this in terms of 5G technologies. We see this in terms of research collaborations, which I'll talk about in a few moments. So it's interesting that the citizenry believes that technology and innovation is an area in which China should take an active global leadership role. We see that this is somewhat consistent throughout the age categories. And when we look at the least important, we see global financial standards and environmental governance having the least importance. This is particularly noteworthy given that China has taken an active sort of leadership role when it comes to environmental governance. And there's also a sort of a global movement over the last 2-3 years to harmonize not only financial standards, but non-financial standards, whereas the EU would have a double materiality standard. The IFRS is hoping to employ that sort of non-financial standard. Simply put, it's not within the citizens' worldview that this is an important issue. Rather, it's peace and security and technology and innovation. Now, the sort of big elephant in the room is whether or not China should limit or expand cooperation. As we sort of hinted, one of the most publicized debates in our jurisdictions is looking at whether we should continue to couple with China, or should we have decoupling or de-risking? Should we unravel trade ties, supply chain, scientific collaboration, and economic interdependence? So in order to gauge the Chinese public's perception on this matter, we do ask a question: should China limit or expand economic cooperation? So rather than being especially pro or anti-decoupling, the public express a preference for expanding trade and investment relations. And they also express a preference for expanding technology and research collaboration with the majority of jurisdictions. This is quite consistent across income levels. And so we see, again, Russia consistently receive the highest score, whereby the citizenry believes they should expand cooperation with Russia, followed by the EU, which is interesting because within EU circles, you do find that there's hawkish sorts of sort of movements and comments that perhaps the EU should de-risk and decouple. And I think ironically, the example that the EU has with Russia is that the EU can potentially decouple from Russia in a successful fashion. And this could potentially be translated into decoupling from China. I would caution with that sort of mentality, because China is a much more sort of heterogeneous kinds of relationships with the EU, where decoupling might be much more detrimental to both sides than, say, the EU-Russia example. Nonetheless, we do see that Japan and India are scoring the lowest, and again, Russia the highest in these indicators. Let's continue onwards and talk about attitudes towards China's global engagement. So the survey asked respondents to rate their agreeableness between 1 and 7, with a series of 6 statements on Chinese foreign affairs and global relationships. So if we look at statement 1 and statement 2, China should currently concentrate more on domestic affairs than on global matters. China is currently too open to foreign influence and thinking. We see that the citizenry generally, disagree, at least in just slightly below that 4 neutral score. So there isn't a major sort of signifier in that respect there. When we look at statements 3 and 4, the more a nation cooperates with China, the better off those nations will be. China's relationship with Western nations will be more competitive rather than cooperative in the next decade. There's a greater agreeableness with these 2 statements. And then finally, in statements 5 and 6, China's political and economic model should be exported to other nations, and China should change international practices and laws to reflect norms and values that are Chinese. We see a disagreeableness for number 5, and we see a slight agreeableness to number 6. Ultimately, what I take from these statements is the domestic public does not have an appetite for exporting China's model globally, and nor do they see that values and norms is a major sort of barrier to cooperation. In fact, they do not advocate in a very strong fashion that China should export Chinese norms and values globally. So it's really fascinating to see that, because as we can see, if there is two entities that have different values and norms, and they perceive that their values and norms are the most important, it's near impossible to have cooperation. And so on the one side here, we see that the Chinese do not see that their norms and values might be a hindrance to future cooperation with other jurisdictions. So if we were to extrapolate that further, that's what I would suggest is some of the takeaways from these sort of attitudinal sort of responses. Okay, let's say a few more words about tourism, study, work, and immigration preferences. Interestingly enough, despite rising tensions between China and most Western jurisdictions, we see that there's a strong desire by the Chinese population to directly engage with Western jurisdictions on a personal level in the next 10 years. Russia is seen as one of the most favorable destinations for travel, work, and immigration. The United States is seen as the most popular destination of choice for studying abroad, followed closely by the United Kingdom. Most immigration preferences at a statistically relevant level revolves around employment and searching for an increased income. Some interesting tidbits as well. Having knowledge in a host nation language generally played a role in the destination of choice, and that kind of makes sense when you think about that. So for those who know French or German, they're more likely to express wanting to visit, study, work, and immigrate to France and Germany. This, of course, does not hold for Japan, and that might be for historical reasons that the Chinese public are acutely aware of being wary of Japan through their history textbooks to, oral sort of histories through their families. When we look at the data in a more disaggregated fashion, the younger cohorts, and by young, I mean age 29 and below, are more likely to express a willingness to immigrate to Germany, followed by Russia. If you're married, you're more likely to want to immigrate to Australia. Individuals living in China's urban areas are more likely to want to immigrate to Australia. For Communist Party members, if they want to immigrate, France is the destination of choice. And so it's quite fascinating from that standpoint there. And the last point, I think it's quite significant as well. Having study abroad experience. So the citizens who did report having study abroad experience or not, it played no statistical role in wanting to immigrate or in a general sense, or wanting to immigrate to that country in which they studied. So we do see that there isn't that major linkages between studying abroad experience and wanting to immigrate to the jurisdictions we examine. So the next thing I would like to talk about is Canada and China relations. And this is quite topical, of course, given that there's been accusations of tampering. There's, that's made the headlines in the news cycle this week. We've seen the detentions of the two Michaels. We've seen China's ban on Canada's canola. And so there's been, deterioration in bilateral relations between Canada and China. Trade between Canada and China has grown significantly since we've established diplomatic relations in 1970. Today, there's about $100 billion Canadian dollars in Canadian exports from China, and about 28.7 billion in Canadian exports to China during 2022. I'm sorry, 100 billion in imports and 28.7 billion in exports to China in 2022. And we do see when we look at polling in Canada that most Canadians do hold a not very favorable view of China. And of course, this has been reinforced with politicians and it's been quite politicized, calling for greater decoupling with China, greater de-risking from China in terms of trade, and increased scrutiny on Chinese select investments and engagement under the guise of potential security risks. So we have this sort of tense sort of environment when we look at Canada-China cooperation. So we asked respondents, what are their views on Canada? And interestingly enough, we find that Chinese respondents are generally warm towards Canada. Chinese citizens have a favorability score greater than 5 in all areas of cooperation between Canada and China we examine. So we looked at economic and business relationships, i.e. investments and trade. We looked at environment and climate change activities. We asked about cultural exchanges, global governance, multilateral organizations, and global and regional peace and security. And across all of these levels of engagement, we see that there is a strong favorability from the Chinese sort of side. So there's also a positive correlation between responses to increasing cooperation between China and Canada in global governance, multilateral organizations, and global and regional peace and security. We can break this down a bit further, and perhaps in Q&As, I can break down many of the things I've been talking about thus far, but particularly the Canada-China cooperation. There's a lot of information that, just for brevity, I'm not able to present, but we do see that there is a more of a favorable environment, a trusting environment, which allow on the Chinese side, at least among the citizenry, which engineers and invites greater collaboration between China if Canada does decide to do so. One of the questions we asked is asking citizens about the perceived factors that have the greatest impact on Canada and China relations. So we gave them 4 options to select. We asked them if China's growing international power could be a hindrance or deterrence or a positive sort of aspect towards Canada-China relations. We asked them about Canada's relationship with the United States. We asked about differences in values between Canada and China. We also asked Canada's domestic politics and policy environment. And what we see is, for the most part, people generally tend to believe that Canada's close relations with the United States is perhaps the most cumbersome variable to influence Canada-China relations. The least cumbersome variable is potential variances and differences in Canadian and Chinese societal values. And again, that is a positive, because if the citizenry believe that there is a clash of values, it's almost it's super difficult to engage and have a fruitful cooperation when there's a value variations between both sides. So I think that is a positive that we can attach from these results. Now, moving on, I want to say a few words about the sources and knowledge of global jurisdictions that the citizens report. Well, we see that respondents consider themselves to be relatively highly knowledgeable of the US and Russia. This is perhaps owing to both jurisdictions' dominance in recent news cycles. But what this chart also indicates is that when there's greater knowledge of the entity, or when they self-report greater knowledge of a particular jurisdiction, they're more likely to trust that jurisdiction. So I think that is a great takeaway. And again, ultimately, when you trust the entity, you're more likely to want to cooperate with the entity in the long term. So I think having that meaningful knowledge is a great sort of proxy to understand trust currently and future trust, which can lead to greater cooperation. Perhaps not surprisingly, because of the same realities we see in our own jurisdictions, is that irrespective of age categories, social media was the most common way to obtain information on global affairs. Again, across all age categories, that is a reality. It's significant. It's significant because if we look at traditional media, television, radio, newspaper, generally speaking, the party has been quite good at influencing the sort of messaging that occurs in the traditional sort of media. This might come in the view of having key talking points for select sensitive issues that television, radio, newspaper may have, to downright censorship. So we see that by virtue of the citizenry using social media as a way to obtain information about global affairs, there is more varied sources of information. Now, of course, this is withstanding the fact that there is censorship on social media, but there are ways around this. You can through VPNs, through political memes, political humor, through code words, and so we see that what this means in many respects is that there is greater information being acquired through social media that may not be as filtered through the eyes of the party. What that also suggests, if you are a foreign jurisdiction, ironically, is that you can influence the way the public perceive certain issues by virtue of using social media to your advantage. Of course, that is the great irony, because that is the attendant fear that we have towards Chinese-backed or Chinese-based sort of social media forums that are in our jurisdictions. But ultimately, we do see social media is the way that the citizenry gets their news about global affairs. The sort of last question that we ask that I'll present today is looking at government action and the popular will. I think this is also interesting to look at because, um, ultimately, if the citizenry cannot divorce the government from the popular will, that can be a bit tricky. Let me put it to you in a different way. Often in our jurisdictions, perhaps the government may not represent the views of the entire population. They may not accurately represent the attitudes of the entire population. And as a result, we can potentially divorce the government's action from perhaps our own thinking and our own sort of mentality towards a particular issue. What we see in the Chinese context amongst the citizenry is that there's broad agreement within the population that a government's action broadly reflects the citizens' will. That means if the Canadian government, for example, does particular action, the citizenry believes that the majority, if not all citizens, believe that this action is reflective of what the citizens want and desire. So that is something to point out, because it tells us that when a government behaves in an X or Y fashion, the citizenry believes that is what is what those jurisdiction citizens actually want, and so we see this results in terms of being quite consistent across age and income demographics. Okay, so the last sort of bit that I want to say a few words about is, what does this all mean? Talk about some of the implications towards some of our findings in many respects. The first thing is that we can suggest is that China really is at a crossroads with its interactions with major Western jurisdictions. The data suggests that the public overwhelmingly supported China to peacefully coexist in the international sphere. This is demonstrable insofar that the citizenry considers global peace and security as the most significant leadership role China should take. Yet with all jurisdictions, there are numerous strategic interests to balance that could compromise this meta goal. Now, China's stated goal to improve its technology and research standing is the most prevalent strategic interest that can incite future global tensions. As I sort of hinted beforehand, in the 14 five-year plan, the current plan, China aims to develop basic research and significant breakthroughs in core technologies to the extent that the nation could be a global leader in technological innovation. They're also increasing R&D investment by 7% annually. And so what we see here is that the citizenry overwhelmingly supports China becoming a global technology and innovation leader. How would China marry both goals to be a leader in global peace and security, and yet develop technology and innovation that ultimately challenges the current hegemony led by the United States, as well as the European Union in many respects? Now, the citizenry does not really account for this, but to be fair, the public does suggest that the United States is the jurisdiction most likely to engage in conflict with China in the next decade. Now, I'm going to give you 3 quick charts here, and what these charts really are trying to do here is we have the 7-scale ordered Likert questions, so we can do some scatter plots based on 7 by 7. Put differently, we can look at, if you trust a partner, if you see the United States as a trusting partner, how does that relate to how you see the importance of the relationship? Now, what this slide, usually you want to have something that's more in the middle of the sort of individualized charts. What we see in the US-China relationship case is that it's super polarized. In other words, the Chinese public, beyond what we should expect, perceives a very polarized relationship towards the United States. Now, the converse occurs with the Russia example. We see that, and this has been a constant theme in this report, and in the surveys, that the Chinese public's increasingly close and favorable relationship with Russia. There's widespread sort of consensus, irrespective of income, about expanding economic ties with Russia. It's seen as a favorable sort of destination for travel, work, and immigration. This viewpoint of Russia is perhaps supported mostly by Chinese social media, which, as I mentioned, is one of the most common ways the citizenry receives information about global affairs, and it paints a quite positive view of Russia. There's also a few other conditions that can that can lead towards this. It can be a very pragmatic one. And what I mean by that is, as the ruble has depreciated since 2014, it's become quite lucrative for Chinese to engage with Russia. And so it kind of makes sense from that standpoint. And what the Russia-Ukraine sort of conflict has illustrated is that the ruble has depreciated even more, so it makes it even much more attractive. If you're looking post-conflict, the post-Russia-Ukraine conflict, China has strategically situated itself to benefit from its sort of partnership with Russia. So in many respects, we see quite the opposite sort of reality from Russia and China versus the United States. And these kinds of plotting illustrates that. Now, just for comparators, I'll show you Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. I'll say a few words about Canada, given where we're located. Respondents who live in large cities are more likely to rank the rise of China higher as a factor affecting Sino-Canadian relationships. Compared with rural respondents, people living in towns, counties, and middle cities are more willing to identify the value difference between both nations as a factor. And we also see that individuals with higher income are more likely to rank the US-Canadian alliance and value differences as factors that can influence. So there's some gradients to this. I mean, I mentioned some general observations, but when you dig deeper into the data, you see some general some specific sort of observations. But ultimately, this is what we should expect when we look at Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, that there is not as much of a polarized kind of relationship that the citizenry perceives. Similarly, with the European Union, Germany, and France, we have a much more normalized kind of relationship that we see. It's not super polarized. India and Japan, we see that there's less favorability across most categories. But again, this is what we should expect. So the outliers thus far has been Russia and the United States using the data analysis. So a few final words. Don't think we should see China's coupling with Russia as a crystallization of a bipolar global order, with Russia and China on one end and Western jurisdictions on the other. As I mentioned, I think the Chinese are super pragmatic in their relationship with Russia. They see that they can strongly benefit from their relationship with Russia, both economically and in other indicators that we looked at. And this is even in a post-conflict with Ukraine, that the citizenry can benefit from that relationship. So they're quite well situated in that respect, in that regard. We also see that there are points of numerous interactions that is supported by the Chinese public that can serve as a means of bridging potential disputes between China and Western jurisdictions. As I sort of mentioned, that there is encouragement that the citizenry does not perceive major differences in values as a significant driver of discontent between China and Western jurisdictions, and that is a positive. It tells us that there's a lot of leeway, a lot of common ground at an ideational level, which can ultimately support common global policy goals, as well as to foster greater bilateral and multilateral kind of relationships with China. So that's a sort of presentation of our survey that I wanted to share with you. Again, this is more of a broad overview. I'm sure you have very specific questions. I'll be happy to answer any of your specific questions or go into greater detail about any of the facets that was mentioned in this particular presentation. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Reza, for that great presentation of our survey and the survey report. And indeed, our survey covers a broad scope of questions. So there's a lot of, we find interesting findings. We are planning to dig deeper into those data and look at specific areas. Maybe we'll produce additional analysis and study that could be country specific and theme specific studies. So do stay tuned for more publication and analysis to come. On that issue, on that topic of high favorability among the Chinese public towards Russia, and just also from our reading of the survey, but also the understanding of the public sentiment as reported in Chinese language media, I think the Chinese public also view Russia as an important counterbalance towards the U.S. and the West. So for many Chinese citizens, that they would like to see Russia remain somehow strong, so it can put China in a more favorable geopolitical strategic position. So that kind of consideration might also play a role in their high favorability towards Russia. And we're also very it kind of nice to see that the Chinese population don't necessarily view the major differences in value systems as a major barrier to advancing relationship and engagement with the West. In that particular case with Canada, as we asked those questions in the Canada-China relations section. So we see that as an encouraging bit of finding from our survey. Now I would like to turn to the questions from our audience member. Here is a question and a comment from a friend of China Institute, Professor Paul Evans. He asked, how significant is membership in the CCP to understanding of China's global outlook? We did indeed included CCP membership as one of the factors the respondents will address. And he also made a comment here. It's a very interesting and important survey that should get wide media coverage. Even the findings run against the mainstream narrative of the moment. Indeed, we did make a massive media outreach and hoping to just get some media interest to, report on the findings. Again, this is based on survey data. We are really hoping to provide evidence-based research. That's one of the main goals of the China Institute is to provide evidence-based research. But of course, currently our media is preoccupied with some other topics, including the release of the former GG's report on foreign interference yesterday. So we do hope that more coverage will be forthcoming, so we can perhaps promote the findings that we identified in this research to a broader audience member in Canada, but also around the world. So Reza, what do you think about this question about the CCP membership, how important it is, this CCP membership, whether it has an impact on the respondents' views on China's global outlook?
So traditionally, how the party members perceive particular issues, we often see there's a lag in terms of how the citizenry perceives. So there's often traditionally been a sort of relationship between party members' views on X, and this follows a year or two or a few years later to how the citizenry believes a particular issue might be. Now, staying within the evidence-based sort of realm here, this is the first iteration of the survey. So in future iterations, we can see if there is an effect looking at how the party members perceive the world versus how the non-party members do, i.e. the general citizenry. So that speaks to the survey. But I think what's particularly alarming is there's less and less interactions between the government, the Chinese government, and Western jurisdictions, and vice versa. And what we can suggest as well, this has been exacerbated further by COVID-19, where there's less government-to-government interactions in a meaningful way. If you don't have those interactions in a very meaningful fashion, you have less trust. It's as simple as that. The less interactions you have, the less you trust the entity. And so we see among party members less trust in generally speaking among the jurisdictions relative to the general population. And what that would suggest to us is that if you are any jurisdiction attempting to engage with China, having more meaningful dialogue, having not only people-to-people exchanges, people-to-people dialogue, but having state-to-state dialogue matters more. So it's counterintuitive and counter to the sort of narratives that we have out there today, where we should disengage with China, we should de-risk from China, we should decouple from China. Ultimately, that serves the opposite effect in terms of trying to influence China. So I think it's when you look at the CPC members, the party members, this could be a preview of things to come, where as we run the future iterations of the survey, we might see less trust in the jurisdictions we're examining. If that relationship holds true, that is, party members' sort of views tend to get filtered down to the citizenry's views with a sort of a time lag.
Well, thank you, Reza. So here's a question that might be slightly related to that. It's from a dear colleague and a friend of the China Institute. In terms of alignment between public opinion and government policy, were the conclusions reached in connection with the COVID lockdowns?
Right. So there's two ways to go about this. The first one is to suggest that, given we looked at in the first quarter of 2023 when there were no lockdowns, we would suggest that this is a sort of a current base reality of how the Chinese population perceives their sort of relationship with Western jurisdiction. So there may not be a major sort of COVID effect. Another way to think about this, we did ask questions about COVID-19. And what we did see, and it wasn't presented in today's sort of presentation, but it is actually front and center in the report as well. We do see that the Chinese public kind of echoes the sort of state's sort of perception on the management of COVID-19 across other jurisdictions. So we do see a strong relationship there in terms of how the public views sort of realities towards COVID-19 and the management of that in other jurisdictions, and the state's views as well. There might be more nuances to that question, so if there's a follow-up to that, I'll be happy to respond to that as well.
Well, thank you. Here's now a question from a colleague from Ken West Foundation. Sharon, her question is about, on the scale of global influence perception, where do Chinese see China positioned on the scale relative to the US and Russia and other countries?
That's a great question. In this survey, we didn't actually ask what citizens thought about themselves. And that is for pragmatic reasons. We just would not be able to ask that sort of questions in the survey sort of work that we're doing. But we were able to ask the citizenry how they perceive other jurisdictions. From other sort of evidence, my own work and others' work, we do see that the citizenry does believe China is increasing its influence. It is increasing its global sort of impact, and in a positive fashion, albeit with the sort of caveat that China should not overtly export its models to global jurisdictions. But ultimately, as China interacts more and more with other jurisdictions, it's not only a monodirectional influence, it's a bidirectional influence, which again reiterates the fact that it is a mistake to decouple, because if you want to influence China, you need to couple with China. There are hidden rules to success in actually engaging with China and influencing China, if you were to turn this question around. And often we find Western jurisdictions do not a very good job in influencing the Chinese sort of perception and Chinese public as well as policy, because they're utilizing strategies that works in our own jurisdictions rather than what might work more effectively given the sort of governance models and the sort of policy sort of process in the Chinese context. So it's quite an interesting question to be asked.
So here's a question about, in a way, our methodology. So for sensitive questions, how do we compensate for self-censorship?
Right, that's a really great question. It comes with experience doing this sort of work. So I've been working on sensitive issues for most of my career, looking at ethnic minorities, looking at social organizations. There are hidden rules to doing this sort of work. So it's not necessarily, it's being reflexive and understanding what questions you're asking. We did not limit ourselves in the questions we asked. We did limit ourselves, mind you, in asking what the Chinese think about themselves, but we did not limit ourselves in any other fashion. We asked exactly the way we would ask it in any other jurisdiction. So that's from that sort of standpoint. Another standpoint, we could statistically examine the validity of the responses using some interesting sort of statistical techniques, which we do utilize, but it's not presented in this report. It might be more academic-y. It might be something that more academics might be interested in, and there will be a version of an academic paper looking at this, where we talk about that and the sort of validity. So the responses have a high accuracy and a high reliability, just using common academic sort of methods to do that. So I think that's why there's great sort of support in understanding how the Chinese public perceives the world from the survey, just because of the methodologies utilized. And it also takes longer to do that. So that's why it did take us much longer to do that than, say, a flash poll. But in terms of self-censorship, there is no, it's not really necessary to do so, given the constructs and given the hidden rules that we are fully aware of in the Chinese context.
Well, thank you, Reza, for that answer. And again, also based on what I read, this is probably not based on scientific study, but there's a general perception when the Chinese public were asked questions that could potentially be sensitive, and they do tend to have a bias of choosing something, choosing the answer that is more closely in line with the more popular view, more mainstream viewpoint in China. And I even saw a number that could affect, have an effect of maybe 20 to 25%. So in a way, if there's the popular view in China is, say, favoring closer relationship with Russia, with the number we see, for example, it's really indicating that's the trend. But that could be factoring in that 20 to 25% fudge factor in a way. So in reality, it's really difficult to find or to identify what exactly that number would be. But in reality, that favorability rating might be slightly lower, just because people think it is popular to show warmth and positivity towards Russia. So it's possible that they will elevate their number a little bit, just to be in line with that view. So again, just a bit of that. So here's a more specific question. We did ask about COVID-19 management of different jurisdictions, and the Chinese perception of how foreign major powers managing their COVID situation, and also in our question about China's global leadership role, we also asked about whether China should take global leadership in global public health. So here's a question on what are there anything we're learning from the survey about health relations with China?
That's a great question. So what we do see is response did not really differentiate between other jurisdictions when it came to how they see foreign jurisdictions performing managing COVID-19. In many respects, you had this sort of negative scores between 3.5 to 3.8 for most jurisdictions. Russia, again, we're talking about a popular or populist sort of bias. We saw Russia was seen as one of the entities that performed well in managing COVID-19. But generally speaking, the citizenry is quite skeptical about how global jurisdictions deal with crises. What's particularly interesting, and this may not stem fully from the sort of survey work, but it's from other work, is that when it came to crisis management, we saw for the first time that the citizenry believe that that non-governmental organizations, social organizations, can actually play a major role in assisting the government to reduce or to aid in crisis management, health management, that is. There's two things we can take away from it. One, generally speaking, the citizenry is quite skeptical or critical. They're critical citizens, if you're going to put it in those terminologies, towards health and health sort of management. And two, they do believe that that the state alone cannot manage a sort of a global crisis or such as COVID-19. The Chinese state cannot do that. And that's from another survey that I've ran, which reinforces that. So you do see these kinds of variations in their perceptions when it comes to this.
Well, thank you, Reza, for that. So, of course, the Chinese Institute and university is part of the University of Alberta. So we are a large comprehensive university with a lot of international students, including students from mainland China. So it's, and also for Canada as a whole, this is something probably many people don't realize is the education as an export of Canada. So it's a service export. If we bring in international students and bringing income from international students, and that is considered a service export. So that is actually a leading category of Canadian exports to China, especially before the COVID pandemic. So here's a question about how, in your opinion, how does the perception of foreign jurisdictions affect Chinese international students, and also the future, I guess, opportunities on scientific research and partnership with China?
So these are two separate questions with two different ways to approach it. The first one, looking at international students and how they perceive global jurisdictions. The United States and the United Kingdom we're seeing with highest regard. And it shows that the reputation of these entities matter a lot. When we disaggregate between the EU and Germany and France, we see differences there where the reputation of a Germany might be much more favorable than reputation of the EU as a conglomerate. In other words, for the highly ranked institutions of higher learning, they still hold quite high, quite sort of appeal to the Chinese public. And that's not going to change anytime soon, it seems, based on what we've seen across age categories. Where we are seeing variances is, and this is more of a larger sort of response, is the age category of 22 and below. When we see the response of much younger respondents, they're not as favorable towards the West as say the older categories are. And this makes it super frustrating if you are trying to understand China, because the generations is so small and their attitudes are so different across these small generational variants, these micro generations. And so ultimately what we're seeing is the favorability towards the West when it comes to education, to study, when it comes to travel and so forth, is a very different reality, the super young versus the other sort of age categories. That may not bode very well for future engagement. Mind you, reputation still matters, but if you're looking at the general trends, the young, the 22 and below have a very different worldview than the older categories. When it comes to research collaboration, that is a tricky one. It is tricky because there are dual use research, of course, especially in sensitive technologies and innovation there, where you can have a security apparatus. If you have a securitization of research, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for certain fields to actually engage in research collaboration. That does not mean the research is not going to happen. And that's the thing that I should point out. Researchers are very good at making connections, whether in the sciences or whether in social sciences or whatever variation you want to look at. We're very good at making connections. And so if there is and generally speaking, if there's a curb or a limitation on research collaboration, it's difficult to curb that fully, because we publish. So I think that is, it goes beyond the sort of exploration of what our survey looks at. But it does what the survey does say is that the public does have an appetite for greater collaboration from a research standpoint. And I think that is something that we should celebrate. Mind you, there should be safeguards for dual use technologies. If we trusted China more, we may not have these safeguards. And it comes back to trust. And to put this in a fullest fashion, there are jurisdictions we engage with, where we engage in research collaboration and technology collaboration, where they are perhaps worse than China in many respects, if I was to speak very bluntly. But we trust them more. And so I think trust is the major variable that plays a role in all of this. And the sort of positive outcome here is that the Chinese public does trust Western jurisdictions for the most part, except for the United States, perhaps. And there is room to increase that trust. And that can only be increased through greater familiarity with the jurisdiction and greater collaboration with the jurisdiction.
Thank you, Reza. Perhaps we will conclude this session maybe with the one last question. So what surprised you the most from the survey data we received, and perhaps what's the least surprising for you?
The most surprising, I think, would be the age sort of differences. How we're seeing, generally speaking, the super young do not see the West in the same regard as the relatively older cohorts. I think that tells you that the population that grew up in the Xi Jinping era, that went to school, secondary school and university during the Xi Jinping era, have a different worldview than those before them. They are more skeptical of the West. They don't necessarily see the West as the only destination of choice. And so that might partially explain their sort of view of Russia, the favorable view of Russia. So that's one of the most surprising ones. I guess was the least surprising, I think it was the second part, right? Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The least surprising is the sort of polarization that is occurring between the United States, partially the European Union, and Western jurisdictions in particular. I think that we have seen this polarization increasing, and it is coming to blows, it seems. And I think that is alarming. It is alarming that we're speaking of decoupling, because it's okay to de-risk, but decoupling is something that we should not do. We should engage with China. If we want to influence China, we engage with China. It's simple as that. That should be the slogan for this whole sort of survey. If you want to actually influence China, you engage with China. It's as simple as that, because it engineers trust. It's a long-term strategy to actually influence China. The opposite is not occurring. Lecturing China is not influencing China. Shaming China does not influence China. And we've seen this across many categories. So I think that's the least surprising sort of observation.
Right. Thank you, Reza, for that, for your excellent presentation, also for that fascinating discussion. So my deep gratitude goes to you, Reza, and also to all the colleagues at the China Institute for your contribution to this survey project. It has been a massive undertaking and a true team effort, many, many months in the making. I would also like to thank our many reviewers for your input and for your comments. And I'm glad to see many of you on this call today. Finally, a big thanks to all the audience members for your participation and very thoughtful questions. You can find the full survey report on our homepage, as noted in the chat. As I mentioned, we do plan to dive deeper into the survey data and produce follow-up country and theme-specific studies, so please stay tuned. Thank you again for joining us today. Do enjoy the rest of your day.